So welcome to part three. Now we are going to get to discuss the fun part of weeds, or at least my favorite part of weed, which is actually managing them. If we did all that we can to prevent them, but they still came fast and furious, really the only thing left for us to do is try to manage the weeds using an integrated approach, which we're going to discuss in part three of this training. Now, before I get too far along into the managing aspects of weed control, I want to first say that it's very important to be able to properly identify the weeds, know the weed's life cycle, and how that weed is spreading before we go and we start choosing these different management approaches. Knowing what the weed is and properly identifying it is going to be the first part of any integrated pest management program. People often don't think that weeds can really be managed with IPM, but IPM also applies to weeds as well. So that's what we're going to discuss here, integrated weed management, which is part of IPM. So weed management strategies. Now that we have the weeds, what can we do? The first thing to look at is the cultural controls of the site conditions. Remember what we talked about in the previous part, that weeds fill in voids. So if the desirable plants are not healthy, that's going to give weeds a foothold to be able to take over and start to spread. Check the irrigation, the fertilization practices. Mowing height is very important for turf grass. Also things like pruning practices and other cultural maintenance practices, and then make corrections if needed. Make sure that everything is on point and everything is being properly done. In landscape planting beds, mulch is going to be the most effective way to manage weeds if that mulch is applied properly. You're going to want to use a large particle mulch, and then for most mulch types, applying it about 2 to 4 inches depending upon the situation. And that's going to outperform virtually every herbicide that you could choose. Mulch really is the foundation of a good weed control program in the landscape. And then also, in addition to mulch, hand pulling the weeds before they flower and reseed can also really help keep the weeds from spreading. Other mechanical methods of control, in addition to hand weed, will include things like hoeing, tilling, and string trimming. These might not be feasible in all situations, but they're going to work in garden areas or in areas prior to planting, or in some cases we can do things like hoeing around established landscape plants and things like that. The last method of control is going to be using chemicals. And in the case of weeds, that would be herbicides, which is a type of pesticide. It's of course going to be very important to apply the herbicides correctly, which we're going to discuss, as well as the different types of herbicides and the different classifications of herbicides, which we'll discuss in the following slides. So what is a herbicide? A herbicide is a type of pesticide, and it's a chemical that's used to kill or inhibit the growth of plants. So in most cases, herbicides are going to be labeled, or they're going to be broadly categorized by the type of weeds that they control, such as broadleaf grass or sedge weeds. It's important to note that weeds can develop resistance to herbicides. So if we use the same herbicide over and over and over again, weeds can develop resistance to that herbicide, and that herbicide will no longer work. So it's important to rotate between different herbicide modes of action in order to delay or prevent herbicide resistance. So using different active ingredients and also using different modes of action is going to be very important. The bottom line is that we don't want to always use the same herbicide. We're not going to get the best results, and we can also that can also lead to herbicide resistance development in those weed species. So just like weeds, we can classify herbicides in different ways. The first way that we can classify herbicides is by timing, or when they're applied in relation to weed emergence. So the two ways that we classify weeds by timing are pre-emergence and post-emergence. Pre-emergence herbicides are the herbicides that we apply before the weeds actually emerge, and they're going to be used to prevent weeds from ever becoming a problem in the first place. In contrast, post-emergence herbicides are applied after the weeds emerge, or after the weeds are already there in the landscape, and so it's more of a corrective approach, whereas pre-emergence herbicides would be a preventative type approach. The next way that we can classify herbicides is how they move in the weed. So contact herbicides are not translocated, and they only affect the plant tissue that is actually contacted by the spray. Systemic herbicides, on the other hand, are translocated throughout the plant or throughout the weed. And once they're sprayed, the herbicide moves in the plant, and it can usually give us more thorough control, especially when we're talking about large annual weeds or perennial weeds with those underground roots and reproductive structures that are underground. We need those translocated herbicides to move into those roots and those underground structures. The final way that we can classify herbicides is by what types of weeds they kill. Selective herbicides would be those that only kill certain types of weeds. And in turfgrass, selective herbicides are used almost exclusively. We apply a herbicide to control the weeds, but without harming the grass. Non-selective herbicides are another type of herbicide, and that will be the herbicides that kill all types of plants, regardless of whether they're a broadleaf grass or sedge. So those wouldn't be used in turfgrass very commonly because it would kill the turfgrass in addition to the weeds. So now let's talk about herbicide timing. And this is the first way that people are going to generally classify herbicides, whether it's a pre or a post, a pre-emergence herbicide or a post-emergence herbicide. So pre-emergence herbicides, or pre-herbicides for short, are applied before the weed seeds germinate. Since the weeds aren't there, the pre-emergence herbicides are applied to the soil, not the weeds themselves. That herbicide is going to stick around in about the top inch or so of the soil after it's applied and after it's watered in. It's not going to move down. It's going to stay in about the top inch of soil. That part of the soil that the herbicide is in, we call that the herbicide active layer, or the herbicide layer that's actually in the soil. So when the weed seeds start to germinate and they're in that herbicide treated soil, the seedlings are going to absorb that herbicide and then they'll die as they germinate. So pre-herbicides don't stop germination. They're just going to kill weeds as they start to germinate, and those little cotyledon leaves come out, or the roots come out, and they make contact with that herbicide-treated soil. Post-emergence herbicide or post-herbicides are applied after the weeds appear or after they emerge from the soil. Post-herbicides are applied to the weeds themselves, and they can be absorbed by the leaves or roots of the plants, and that's after they've already emerged and after we're seeing them and they're already causing a problem. So for pre-emergence herbicides that have to be applied before the weeds emerge to be effective, timing is going to be critical, and it's usually going to be based upon soil temperature. They won't control emerged weeds, so they have to be applied before the weed seeds start to germinate for us to see a benefit of those. So after pre-emergence herbicides are applied, they need to be watered in order to be quote-unquote activated. So remember that pre-herbicides are going to go into that top inch or so of soil. We don't want to stick on top of the soil or stick on top of the turf grass. We want to move into the soil. And so to do that, we have to apply rainfall or we have to apply irrigation, or rainfall has to occur. So that's how we activate those herbicides. So how much water do you need to apply to properly activate the herbicide? Well, the herbicide label is going to provide that information on how to do this and how much water is going to be required, because it can be different for different herbicides. So no pre-herbicide is going to provide season-long control. In Florida, they're going to be effective for around 6 to 12 weeks or so, but that really just depends upon the herbicide and the rate that it's applied. So to get control throughout the year, pre-emergence herbicide would have to be reapplied. And again, the label is going to give instructions on how to do this and application intervals and things like that. But remember that just like with post-emergence herbicides, with pre-emergence herbicides, we need to rotate those and use different active ingredients and different modes of action, so the herbicide-resistant weeds don't develop, or really we don't select for herbicide-resistance weeds. Since pre-emergence herbicides will kill weeds as they germinate and may inhibit roots, most pre-emergence herbicides should not be applied soon before or after seeding or laying down new sod. Again, labels are going to give instructions for specific herbicides in specific situations. So again, there's really no substitute for reading and understanding the entire label before you use a herbicide. So when should pre-emergence herbicides be applied? If timing is very important, when should we really apply those? It's going to need to be based upon soil temperature rather than by a calendar date. But as a general rule, they should be applied around early February for South Florida, mid-February for Central Florida, and early March for North Florida. While those general dates can be a good general guideline, we want to watch the temperature or the thermometer a lot more closely than we watch the calendar. We want to target the first pre-emergence herbicide application for when the daytime temperatures are around 65 to 70 degrees for 4 or 5 consecutive days. The first application is going to target the warm season weeds, and especially those warm season weeds that germinate first or earlier in the spring, like crabgrass. For other warm season weeds that germinate later in the year, like doveweed, an additional pre-emergence application will be needed around late April or May. And then for cool season weeds, the general rule of thumb would be making the application in late October to early November for Central and South Florida, and early October for North Florida. Or when temperatures drop to around 55 to 60 degrees for a few consecutive days. That's when we're going to start to see those cool season weeds like chickweed or annual bluegrass. That's when those are going to start to show up and start to become problems. So now we'll talk a little bit about post-emergence herbicides. So post-emergence herbicides are going to be applied to control weeds that have already emerged. And a lot of different things can reduce their effectiveness or their efficacy. So timing can be important with post-emergence herbicides as well, just like with pre-emergence herbicides. So for example, if we wait until the weeds become mature, the control of the efficacy of those herbicides is going to be reduced. We want to control weeds when they're small and when they're more vulnerable to herbicides. That's going to allow us to use a lower rate, and in some cases, we're still going to be able to get good control at those lower labeled rates. Likewise, we want to control weeds before they start producing seeds. That's going to increase the control that we get and also prevent new seedlings or new weed inoculum from emerging weeds after we treat. If we prevent the seed production, we prevent those future weed generations from ever coming about. And so it might seem counterintuitive, but we also want weeds to be healthy and actively growing for the herbicides to work their best. So when weeds are stressed, their growth is going to slow down and the effectiveness of the herbicide can be reduced. And that's because when a weed is not actively growing or not growing very fast and it's stressed, the translocation of that herbicide can be reduced if the growth is reduced. Also, always check the label information for in regards to mowing, because mowing immediately before or after a herbicide application can reduce the effectiveness of some herbicides or make some herbicides completely ineffective depending upon the product. So in general, mowing should be avoided for several days before or after a herbicide application for it to work best. But the label is going to give specific instructions on that for each herbicide. So next we're going to talk about the different types of post-emergence herbicides, including selective and non-selective herbicides and contact and systemic herbicides. So first, herbicides can be selective or non-selective, and that's going to be the classification. That's going to refer to the types of weeds that they control. So selective herbicides are only going to control certain types of weeds, and they don't have any effect on, or at least a limited effect on, other types of weeds. So most herbicides that people use in turf grass are going to be selective. Herbicides can be broadleaf selective, sedge selective, or grass selective. Grass selective herbicides, for example, are called graminicides. They only affect plants in the grass family. Some example of some herbicides that will be selective would be things like atrazine or 2,4-D, which are very commonly used, and they only affect broadleaf plants. In planting beds, people most commonly use non-selective herbicides and spot treat the weeds. So non-selective herbicides control or kill all types of plants and will include herbicides like glyphosate or diclot, which basically will control any type of plant that is there. So post-emergence herbicides, both selective and non-selective herbicides can be contact or systemic. And contact or systemic is going to refer to how the herbicide actually moves in the plant. So contact herbicides like diclot only affect the plant tissues that are directly contacted by the spray. The herbicide is not translocated, so the roots of the plant are not affected. This is okay for small annual weeds, but large annual weeds or perennial weeds are usually going to require multiple applications for control. If you look at this slide here, if this weed was just treated with a contact herbicide right here on this leaf, that leaf would probably fall off, but the rest of the plant will be completely unaffected, as would the roots. Now, in contrast, with systemic herbicides, they move from the leaves to the roots, or they might move from the roots to the leaves, or vice versa, or both, depending upon the herbicide. They're translocated, or they move throughout the plant. An example of this will be glyphosate. Because these herbicides have to move throughout the plant tissues in order to work, they generally work more slowly than contact herbicides. It might take a week or two to see symptoms after treating weeds with a systemic herbicide, whereas you might see symptoms from a contact herbicide in less than 30 minutes in some cases. So, for example, we look back at this picture. If this weed was treated with a systemic herbicide, that herbicide could move throughout the plant and get down and give you complete control of the plant because it was able to move throughout all the vascular systems of the plant and move down into the roots. So now we'll talk a little bit about fertilizer or herbicide mixtures, or basically what they're called lawn weed and feed type products for short. So there's a lot of weed and feed type products that are marketed towards homeowners that are basically herbicide impregnated fertilizers, and they can both fertilize and kill weeds at the same time. And the idea is that you can fertilize the lawn and kill weeds and fertilize at the same time, and then you save time, and then in some cases the goal is to save money as well. But it's important to remember that fertilizer and the fertilizer rate and the herbicide rate need to be dialed in to meet the nutrient needs of the turf, and then the herbicide rate, the herbicide needs to be applied at a rate that's at the right requirement for the weeds. So it can be tricky to balance those. It can be tricky to apply the right amount of fertilizer for the turf grass and then the right amount of herbicide for the specific weed species that are on a particular lawn. So weed and feed products are generally not recommended for this reason, because it is difficult to match both of those needs with one product applied at the same time. And they're usually not recommended. You can usually get better results by applying fertilizers and herbicides separately. But some of these products can be useful if there is a big weed infestation and the product contains the right fertilizer ratio at the right rate, and the herbicide that's at the right rate that's needed for the weeds, and the weed population is fairly uniform across the lawn. We don't just have a few weeds there. We don't want to over apply that herbicide if we need it, but if we do have a weed situation where the weeds over the entire lawn, these weed and feed products might make sense, because we might need to fertilize the entire lawn and then control a weed that's throughout the entire lawn. This could also be useful if the weed and feed has only a pre-emergence herbicide impregnated on it, because a pre-emergence herbicide is going to be broadcast or applied over an entire lawn. We don't spot spray pre-emergence herbicides. Those will be broadcast over the entire area. So in some cases, a weed and feed with a pre-emergence herbicide might be useful as well. It really just depends upon the product. If there's not a uniform weed population, you're usually going to get better results, and it's generally recommended that you spot treat those weeds with a post-emergence herbicide. That's usually going to give you better results and save on cost, because less herbicide is needed. We don't want to over-apply herbicide or apply a post-emergence herbicide to an area that doesn't have any weeds. That doesn't make much sense. Another important thing to remember with these weed and feed products, or really any post-emergence herbicide in general, is to read the label. And I say this many times in this training, but it is very important, and it's a very important part of weed management. And one of the reasons that it's important is that a lot of turf herbicides, and a lot of weed and feed products like atrazine or metsulfuron, those herbicides can be absorbed by the roots of ornamental trees or shrubs, and they can be damaged by those if we get those weed and feed products too close to those ornamental plants. In some cases, palms or trees might be planted in turf areas, and it's going to be tough to avoid those. How far do roots extend? Oftentimes people think it's just around the drip line of a tree, when in fact those roots can extend 2 to 3 times the drip line of that tree. So in some landscapes, it will be completely impossible to avoid applying these herbicides around the root zone of those ornamental plants. So read the label and follow those instructions to be sure that you're not applying something that could be harmful to a very highly valued ornamental tree that's in the landscape. A lot of trees are killed each year because people didn't follow the label instructions. These products won't cause any damage if those label instructions are followed. When we start to see problems, it's because people didn't read and follow those label directions. So just like all pesticides, herbicides can present some level of toxicity to non-target organisms. Most likely it's going to be non-target plants, but they can also cause damage to people or pets if they're not used according to label instructions and those directions aren't followed properly. The most valuable time that you can spend in regard to using any pesticide is to read the entire label. It doesn't matter if you've bought the same pesticide for years, you need to read it every time you buy it. And even every time before you apply it, just to refresh yourself. Pesticides that are marketed towards homeowners are notorious for changing active ingredients or even application directions without changing the name of the product or really how it looks on the store shelf. You might buy the same thing every year, but then one year they change the directions. So if you don't read the directions, you're just buying it because of the way that the label looks and you're familiar with this particular product. You could have very dire consequences. If you don't read the label, you could cause a lot of damage, both environmentally and then also financially, because you might be replacing some plants. So just be sure to follow all directions, whether require personal protective equipment or PPE, and follow the label guidelines for the restricted entry interval, or REI for short. So no one should enter the treated area without the proper PPE and before the restricted entry interval period is up. That's going to be different for different pesticides. So again, read the label and follow those instructions. So for some herbicides, the label might specify that it's not intended for use by anyone other than a licensed professional. So in those cases, you're probably going to need to hire someone with a license to come in and apply it. And if you don't know how to read, or you're not confident in your ability to interpret a label or to apply a pesticide, or you just don't have the right application equipment to apply it properly, it's also going to usually be better to get a licensed professional to come in and apply the product or to treat the area for you as well. Herbicides are great tools for weed management, but that's all that they are. They're just tools, and they shouldn't be used as a standalone approach. They could be part of a good integrated weed management program if they're used correctly, but they should be combined with other tactics and strategies, like those non-chemical methods that we talked about, like proper cultural practices, mechanical controls, and then other non-chemical controls like mulching and then regular maintenance of the turf grass and the landscape plants. Combining all these strategies properly, along with preventing the weeds by following those guidelines that we discussed in part 1 and part 2, is always going to give you the best results, the best overall results for weed control that are possible. And so finally, this training program, I want to acknowledge everyone that made this training program possible. It was made possible with help and input from Sydney Park Brown, Kathy Oliver, Greg McDonald, and Ramon Leon. I want to thank all those people for their contribution to this training, and also want to thank you all for your time and your attention. I hope you enjoyed learning a little bit more about weeds in the landscape and hopefully how to control those as well.